Language of the Body Reread in the Truth. General Audience number 105 of January 19th, 1983. The texts of the prophets have great importance for understanding marriage as a covenant of persons in the image of Yahweh's covenant with Israel, and particularly for understanding the sacramental covenant of man and woman in the dimension of sign. The language of the body enters, as we saw earlier, into the integral structure of the sacramental sign, whose main subject is man, male and female. The words of conjugal consent constitute this sign, because the spousal meaning of the body and its masculinity and femininity finds expression in them. This meaning is expressed above all by the words, "I take you as my wife, as my husband." In addition, these words confirm the essential truth of the language of the body and, at least indirectly, implicitly. They also exclude the essential untruth, the falseness of the language of the body. The body speaks the truth through conjugal love, faithfulness, and integrity, just as untruth or falsity is expressed through all that negates conjugal love, faithfulness, and integrity. One can thus say that when they pronounce the words of conjugal consent, the new spouses set themselves on the line of the same prophetism of the body, whose spokesmen were the ancient prophets. The language of the body, expressed by the lips of the ministers of marriage as a sacrament of the Church, institutes the same visible sign of the covenant and of grace, which, though its origin goes back to the mystery of creation, is continually nourished with the power of the redemption of the body offered by Christ to the Church. According to the prophetic texts, the human body speaks a language of which it is not the author. Its author is man, who, as male or female, as bridegroom or bride, correctly rereads the meaning of this language. He thus rereads that spousal meaning of the body as integrally inscribed in the structure of the masculinity or femininity of the personal subject. A correct rereading in the truth is an indispensable condition for proclaiming this truth or instituting the visible sign of marriage as a sacrament. The spouses proclaim exactly this language of the body, reread in the truth as the content and principle of their new life in Christ and in the Church. On the basis of the prophetism of the body, the ministers of the sacrament of marriage perform an act of prophetic character. They confirm in this way their share in the prophetic mission of the Church. A prophet is one who expresses with human words the truth that comes from God, who speaks this truth in the place of God, in his name, and in some sense with his authority. All of this refers to the new spouses, who as ministers of the sacrament institute with the words of conjugal consent the visible sign, proclaiming the language of the body reread in the truth as the content and principle of their new life in Christ and the Church. This prophetic proclamation has a complex character. Conjugal consent is both the announcement and the cause of the fact that from now on the two are husband and wife before the Church and society. We mean this announcement as an indication in the ordinary sense of the term. Nevertheless, conjugal consent has above all the character of a reciprocal profession of the new spouses before God. It is enough to examine the text attentively to become convinced that this prophetic proclamation of the language of the body, reread in the truth, is immediately and directly addressed by the I to the you, by the man to the woman, and by her to him. The central position in conjugal consent belongs precisely to the words that indicate the personal subject, the pronouns I and you. By the words of the new spouses, the language of the body, reread in the truth of its spousal meaning, constitutes the communion of persons. If conjugal consent has a prophetic character, if it is the proclamation of the truth that comes from God, and in some sense the act of stating this truth in the name of God, then this comes about above all in the dimension of interpersonal communion, and only indirectly before others and for others. On the background of the words spoken by the ministers of the sacrament of marriage, there stands the perennial language of the body, to which God himself gave its beginning by creating man, male and female, a language that was renewed by Christ. This perennial language of the body bears within itself the whole richness and depth of the mystery, first of creation, then of redemption. When they bring into being the visible sign of the sacrament through the words of their conjugal consent, they express in this sign the language of the body with the whole depth of the mystery of creation and of redemption. The liturgy of the sacrament of marriage offers a rich context of this expression. When they reread the language of the body in this way, the spouses not only include in the words of conjugal consent the subjective fullness indispensable for bringing the sign of precisely this sacrament into being, but they also reach in some sense the very sources from which this sign each time draws its prophetic eloquence and sacramental strength. One must not allow oneself to forget that before being spoken by the lips of the spouses, the ministers of the sacrament, as a sacrament of the church, the language of the body was spoken by the word of the living God. From the beginning, in Genesis, through the prophets of the Old Covenant, all the way to the author of Ephesians. Here we are using again and again the expression language of the body, in which we go back to the prophetic texts. In these texts, as we said already, the human body speaks a language of which it is not the author in the proper sense of the term. The author is man, male and female, who rereads the true sense of that language, thereby bringing to light again the spousal meaning of the body as integrally inscribed in the very structure of the masculinity and femininity of the personal subject. Already, through itself per se, this rereading of the language of the body in the truth gives a prophetic character to the words of conjugal consent, through which man and woman bring into being the visible sign of marriage as a sacrament of the church. These words, however, contain something more than a simple rereading in the truth of the language that the femininity and masculinity of the new spouses speaks of in their reciprocal relation. Quote, I take you as my wife, as my husband. The words of conjugal consent contain within themselves the intention, the decision, and the choice. Both of the spouses decide to act in conformity with the language of the body reread in the truth. If man, male and female, is the author of that language, he is so above all inasmuch as he wants to give and effectively does give to his behavior and to his actions the meaning in conformity with the reread eloquence of the truth of masculinity and femininity in the reciprocal conjugal relationship. In this area, man is the causal origin of actions that have through themselves, per se, clear-cut meanings. He is thus the causal origin of actions and at the same time the author of their meanings. The sum of these meanings constitutes, in some sense, the whole of the language of the body, with which the spouses decide to speak to each other as ministers of the sacrament. The sign they bring into being with the words of the conjugal consent is not merely an immediate and fleeting sign, but a sign that looks toward the future and produces a lasting effect, namely the conjugal bond, one and indissoluble, quote, all the days of my life, that is, until death. In this perspective, they must fill that sign with the manifold contents offered by the conjugal and familial communion of persons, and also with the content that springs from the language of the body and is continually reread in the truth. In this way, the essential truth of the sign will remain organically linked with the ethos of conjugal conduct. Into this truth of the sign, and consequently into the ethos of conjugal conduct, there is inserted in a future-related perspective the procreative meaning of the body, that is, fatherhood and motherhood, which we discussed earlier. To the question, are you ready to accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? The man and the woman answer yes. We now postpone further in-depth discussion of the subject to other meetings.